A mother's life was shattered the day her 2-year-old daughter disappeared from their family farm, vanishing without a trace after being left to play near the cornfield. For just a few minutes, for years, the farming family mourned, never knowing what had happened while the mother struggled to forgive herself for leaving her daughter unattended. Every investigation, LED, nowhere, leaving them with nothing but heartache and unanswered questions. But 10 years later, by pure coincidence, she entered a neighbor's pig barn, and there she found a clue that would lead her to uncover the shocking and unbelievable truth behind her daughter's disappearance. Before we dive into the shocking story, let us know where you're watching from today. And if you like this video, don't forget to subscribe. The midday sun beat down mercilessly on the sprawling Nebraska farmland, casting long shadows across the weathered barn and the endless rows of corn that stretch to the horizon. Maggie Landry, now 50 years old, wiped the sweat from her brow as she made her way towards the farmhouse. The years had etched deep lines into her face, each one ATT testament to the hardships she'd endured. As she reached the mudroom, Maggie began the familiar ritual of removing her dirt-caked boots. The cool air inside was a welcome respite from the sweltering heat outside. She bent down, intending to place her boots on the lowest shelf, a space she'd always kept clear for quick storage. But as her hands reached out, they froze midair. They're tucked away in the corner. Partially hidden by shadows was a pair of small cowboy boots. Maggie's breath caught in her throat as a wave of memories crashed over her. Those weren't just any boots. They belonged to Fiona, her daughter, who had vanished without a trace. 10 years ago, Maggie's trembling fingers reached out, gently brushing against the worn leather. In an instant, she was transported back in time. She could almost see Fiona standing before her, a vibrant 2-year-old with fiery, red hair and a smile that could light up the darkest room the little girl had loved. Those boots insisting on wearing them everywhere, even to bed, if Maggie had let her. The vision was so vivid, so real, that for a moment Maggie forgot to breathe. Fiona had been the light of their lives, bringing joy and laughter to the farm that now seemed cold and purposeless. Every day since her disappearance had been a struggle, each moment filled with grief and haunting memories. Maggie's mind wandered back to that fateful day, replaying the scene that had tormented her for a decade. She had left Fiona to play near the cornfield, thinking she'd be safe for just a few minutes. But when Maggie returned, the little girl was gone. They had searched, frantically convinced she had simply gotten lost in the tall corn. But as hours turned into days and days into weeks, the horrible truth began to sink in. Fiona wasn't just lost, she was gone, with a heavy heart. Maggie picked up the tiny boots she couldn't bear to leave, them there. A constant reminder of her greatest failure. She decided to take them to the attic, where they wouldn't catch her off guard again, bringing fresh pain with each unexpected sighting as she made her way through the house boots. In hand, Maggie passed the living room, where her husband, Hank, was preparing their lunch. He glanced up, a question forming on his lips, but it died as soon as he saw what she was carrying. Understanding passed between them, silent but profound. No words were needed. They both knew the weight of what those little boots represented. Maggie continued on her way, climbing the creaky stairs to the attic. The musty air and dim light added to the somber mood as she found a quiet corner to place the boots before setting them down. She held them close to her chest and whispered a promise into the stillness. Fiona, My sweet girl. She murmured, her voice thick with emotion. I know you're out there somewhere. Mom and Dad will never stop looking for you. We'll find you. I promise. With trembling hands, she gently placed the boots down and turned away, unable to look at them any longer. As she descended the stairs, Maggie tried to steel herself for the rest of the day, knowing that the ghost of her missing daughter would haunt her every step. Maggie made her way back to the living room, where Hank was waiting at the table. The smell of freshly prepared food filled the air, but neither of them felt much like eating. Maggie slid into her chair, her eyes meeting Hank's across the table. The years of shared grief had created a silent language between them, and she could read the concern in his gaze. I'm sorry, Hank, Maggie said, softly, gesturing at the spread before them. You went to all this trouble, but I just don't have an appetite anymore. Maybe we can save it for dinner. Hank nodded, understanding all too well. He pushed his own plate away. The food barely touched for a moment. They sat in silence, the weight of their loss hanging heavy in the air between them. Finally, Hank cleared his throat, his voice hesitant as he broached the subject they both dreaded and clung to, in equal measure. Have you heard anything from the investigators? Any new clues about Fiona? Maggie felt her heart constrict at the question. How many times had they asked each other this over the years? How many times had hope flared only to be extinguished by another dead end? She shook her head slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. No, nothing new. I called the police department yesterday, but it's the same old story. No leads, no updates, no clues. She paused, the words bitter on her tongue. They're not even updating us as frequently anymore. I think they might be giving up. Tears welled up in Maggie's eyes, and she blinked rapidly, trying to hold them back. Do you think we'll ever find her? Hank, is she really out there somewhere? Hank reached across the table, taking Maggie's hand in his. His grip was firm, reassuring, even as his own eyes glistened with unshed tears. We'll find her, Maggie. She's out there somewhere, and we won't stop looking. Not ever. They sat in silence for a few more moments, neither of them touching the food. Finally, Hank stood up and began clearing the plates. Maybe we should cut our break short, he suggested. There's still plenty of work to be done, and it might help, to keep busy. Maggie nodded in agreement, rising from her chair. You're right. What did you have in mind? I need to clean out the barn, Hank replied. Could use an extra pair of hands if you're free. Maggie shook her head. I wish I could, but I've got to deliver those hay bales to the neighboring farms. They've been waiting since morning, and I don't want to keep them any longer. Hank nodded, understanding. They moved together towards the door, each preparing to lose themselves in the familiar routines of farm work, hoping to find some respite from the grief that never truly left them as they stepped out into the harsh sunlight. Maggie couldn't help but cast one last glance back at the house. Somewhere in that attic, a pair of tiny cowboy boots sat in silent testimony to their enduring hope and unending sorrow. The old pickup truck rumbled down the dusty country road, its bed laden with hay bales. Maggie gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white with tension. She'd already made several deliveries, each one a welcome distraction from the tumultuous emotions stirred up by finding Fiona's boots as she approached her final destination, the Becca family farm. Maggie felt a familiar knot of anxiety form in her stomach. She hoped against hope that Clay Becker wouldn't be there to receive the delivery. Perhaps one of his farm hands would handle it. Instead, the bad blood between their families ran deep a conflict that had begun years ago, when Maggie's parents still ran the farm. Despite the animosity, the Beckers still ordered hay from the Landrys. They depended on it, and Maggie and Hank weren't stubborn enough to refuse the business. Deep down, Maggie harbored a faint hope that one day they might be able to mend fences and put the old quarrel to rest as the truck crested a small hill. The Becca farmhouse came into view. Maggie's heart sank as she spotted a figure standing in the yard, unmistakably Clay Becker. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the uncomfortable interaction ahead. Pulling up to the barn, Maggie cut the engine and climbed out of the truck. Clay stood there, his face set in a scowl that seemed permanently etched into his features. "Hello," Clay Maggie said, forcing a polite tone. Clay's response was curt, barely more than a grunt. "Hello" together. They worked in tense silence to unload the hay bales and stack them in the barn. The air between them was thick with unspoken hostility, making the simple task feel like an eternity as they finished. Maggie wiped the sweat from her brow and turned to Clay. "I'll send the invoice over later today," she said. Clay merely nodded, already, turning away without so much as a word of thanks. Maggie watched him go, a mixture of frustration and sadness washing over her. She knew Clay resented having to rely on their hay, but his stubborn refusal to even attempt civility grated on her nerves as she walked back to her truck. Maggie couldn't help but feel a small sense of satisfaction. Despite everything, the Beckers still needed them. It wasn't much. But in the face of their continued hostility, it was something to hold on to. As Maggie approached her truck, to leave the Becca farm behind, a sudden commotion caught her attention. A small pink blur darted past her, accompanied by a chorus of startled squeals. Instinctively, she turned to see a young pig racing across the farmyard, clearly having escaped from its pen. Without thinking, Maggie sprang into action. Years of farm life had honed her reflexes, and she quickly gave chase to the runaway animal. The pig, though small, was surprisingly quick, leading Maggie on a brief but energetic pursuit around the barn. Finally, after a few moments of zigzagging, the little pig seemed to tire. It slowed down, just enough for Maggie to catch up and scoop it into her arms. The animal squirmed briefly before settling, seemingly resigned to its capture. Maggie stood there slightly out of breath, holding the pig and looking around. She called out Clay, "Anyone?" But no response came. The farm seemed idly quiet, with no sign of Clay or any of his words. A frown creased Maggie's forehead. It wasn't like Clay to be so careless with his livestock. She'd always known him to be a meticulous farmer. Despite their personal differences, the idea of an animal escaping without anyone noticing struck her as odd. Still holding the pig, Maggie began to walk towards where she thought the pig enclosures might be. Over the years, she'd gained a general understanding of the layout of the Becca farm, though she'd never had reason to explore it thoroughly as she approached a large barn-like structure. The sound of grunting and snuffling confirmed she was in the right place. The strong, musky odor of pigs grew stronger as she neared the entrance. Maggie pushed open the heavy door with her free hand, the hinges creaking loudly in the stillness. Inside, the air was thick and warm, filled with the sounds and smells of dozens of pigs. She squinted, allowing her eyes to adjust to the dimmer light. Within the barn, row upon row of pens stretched out before her, each containing several pigs of various sizes. Maggie walked slowly down the central aisle, looking for an empty pen. or one that seemed to be missing an occupant as she neared the back of the barn. Something caught her eye. There, partially buried in the dirt in front of one of the pens, was a small, pink object. Maggie knelt down, still clutching the escaped pig, and brushed away some of the dirt with her free hand, her breath sea in her throat as she realized what it was. A Hello Kitty headband, the kind a little girl might wear. Maggie's mind raced. What was a child's headband doing in a pig barn? She knew Clay didn't have any children. He'd always been a confirmed bachelor as far as she knew. And they certainly never had visitors with young children, at least not that she'd ever seen. As she stood there, confusion and an inexplicable sense of unease washing over her. A gruff voice suddenly shattered the quiet. "What the hell are you doing here? Get out!" Maggie spun around to see Clay Becker standing in the doorway, his face contorted with anger. She fumbled for words, caught off guard by his sudden appearance and hostile tone. "One of your pigs got out," she managed to stammer, gesturing with the animal still in her arms. "I was just trying to bring it back." But Clay cut her off, his voice. "Risen, I don't care what you think you're doing. Leave now, or I'm calling the police." Maggie was taken aback by the intensity of his reaction. Sure, they'd never been on good terms, but this level of anger seemed extreme, even for Clay. Something about his demeanor, the wild look in his eyes, sent a chill down her spine. Wordlessly, she set the pig down in the nearest pen and began to back away. Towards the door, Clay watched her every move. His body tense, fists clenched at his sides as she passed him in the doorway. Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The headband, Clay's overreaction, the escaped pig, none of it added up. But with Clay glaring at her, practically vibrating with barely contained rage, she knew this wasn't the time to ask questions. Clay followed her all the way back to her truck, watching as she climbed in and started the engine. As Maggie pulled away, she glanced in her rearview mirror to see Clay still standing there, watching her leave the encounter. Left her shaken, her mind whirling with questions and a growing sense of unease as Maggie's truck rumbled down the dusty road leading away from the Becca farm. Her mind was in turmoil. The strange encounter with Clay, the mysterious headband, and the overall sense of wrongness she'd felt in that barn, it all swirled in her thoughts, refusing to settle. She'd nearly reached the end of the Becca property when a sudden, powerful impulse gripped her. Instead of continuing on her way home, Maggie found herself pulling over to the side of the road. Her hands trembled slightly as she put the truck in park and cut the engine for a long moment. She sat there staring back at the distant silhouette of the Becca farmhouse. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the fields and bathing everything in a warm golden light that belied the unease churning in Maggie's gut. "This is crazy," she muttered to herself, even as she opened the truck door and stepped out. But she could shake the feeling that if she left now, she'd be making a terrible mistake. Taking a deep breath to steady herself, Maggie began walking back towards the farm. She didn't have a plan exactly, but she knew she needed answers. The decades-long feud between their families suddenly seemed trivial in the face of what she'd just experienced. As she approached the farmhouse, she saw Clay emerge from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He froze when he spotted her, his face darkening with anger once more. "I thought I told you to leave," he growled as Maggie drew. Near Maggie, held up her hands in a plating gesture. "I know, Clay, and I'm sorry for intruding earlier, but I think it's time we talked about this thing between our families." Clay's scowl deepened. There's nothing to talk about. Go home, Maggie. But Maggie stood her ground. Look, I know you don't like us. I know there's bad blood. But we've been neighbors for decades. We do business together. Don't you think it's time we tried to sort this out to be, if not friends, at least civil? For a moment, something flickered in Clay's eyes. Uncertainty, perhaps, or a hint of some deeper emotion. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by his usual mask of hostility. It's fine how it is, he said flatly. I don't need new friends now. If you'll excuse me, I have work to do. He turned to walk away. Maggie felt frustration rising within her. She'd extended an olive branch, and Clay had all but slapped it away. But as he was about to disappear back into the barn, a thought struck her. Hey, Clay, she called out. He paused, looking back at her with obvious irritation. What Maggie hesitated for a split second, then plunged ahead. I didn't know you had a child. A girl, right? Congratulations. The effect of her words was immediate and startling. Clay seemed to freeze in place, his face draining of color, before flushing a deep angry red for a moment. Maggie thought he might explode with rage, but then with visible effort, Clay composed himself. His voice, when he spoke, was tightly controlled. I don't have a child, he said. Now please leave my property. Maggie stood there stunned into silence. If Clay didn't have a child, then whose headband was that in the barn? Why had he reacted so strongly to her assumption? As Clay disappeared into the barn, slamming the door behind him, Maggie slowly made her way back to her truck. Her mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Clay's reaction had been far too extreme for a simple misunderstanding. There was something he was hiding, something that had to do with a child, a girl. As she climbed back into her truck and started the engine, Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that she'd stumbled upon something far more sinister than she'd initially thought. The pieces didn't fit together yet. But she knew one thing for certain: she couldn't let this go. Whatever secret Clay was keeping, she was determined to uncover it with one last look at the Becca farm in her rearview mirror. Maggie pulled back onto the road. Her heart was pounding, and her palms were sweaty on the steering wheel. She didn't know what her next move would be, but she knew she couldn't face this alone. It was time to talk to Hank together. Maybe they could make sense of this unsettling puzzle, and maybe find the answers they'd been seeking for so long. The truck's tires crunched on the gravel as Maggie drove away from the Becca farm, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and growing suspicion. The encounter with Clay kept replaying in her head, each detail seeming more significant with every passing moment. As she navigated the familiar country roads, her thoughts drifted back to the pink Hello Kitty headband she'd found in the pig bee barn. It was such an incongruous item to find in that setting, and Clay's reaction to her mention of a child had been nothing short of alarming. Suddenly, a thought struck Maggie with such force that she instinctively slammed on the brakes, bringing the truck to a jarring halt in the middle of the deserted road. Her heart began to race as a long-buried memory surfaced. Headband. She whispered to herself, her voice trembling in her mind's eye. She saw Fiona, her precious little girl, wearing a white headband. Fiona didn't have the same pink Hello Kitty headband. It was a white one. A gift from her grandmother. She had loved that headband, wearing it almost every day before she disappeared. How could Maggie have forgotten such a detail? She shook her head, trying to clear her thoughts. No, it couldn't be. It was too far-fetched, too coincidental. She'd been so focused on her work on trying to move forward that she'd pushed aside many memories of Fiona. But now, with the image of that pink headband fresh in her mind, the connection seemed impossible to ignore. Maggie's hands shook as she reached for her phone. She knew what she was thinking. Sounded crazy, even to her own ears. But Clay's strange behavior, the decades-old family conflict, the mysterious headband, it all seemed to be pointing towards a possibility so horrifying she could barely bring herself to consider it. What if? What if Clay had something to do with Fiona's disappearance? The thought made her feel physically ill. It was almost too much to bear the idea that for 10 long years her daughter might have been so close, yet so impossibly far away. With trembling fingers, Maggie dialed Hank's number. It rang several times before he picked up his voice. Concerned Maggie. "What's wrong? You sound worried, Hank," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need you to come to me right now. I'm parked on the old Miller Road about a mile past the crossroads." "What's going on?" Hank asked, alarm evident in his tone. "I'll explain when you get here," Maggie replied. "Please, just hurry." She ended the call and sat there. 2141. Her mind racing. Part of her wanted to drive straight back to the Becca farm, to demand answers from Clay. But she knew that would be foolish and potentially dangerous if there was even the slightest chance that her wild suspicions were correct. She couldn't risk tipping Clay off. The minutes ticked by, agonizingly slowly as Maggie waited for Hank. She tried to calm herself, to think rationally about what she'd seen and heard. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw that pink headband lying half buried in the dirt of Clay Becca's pig barn. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably only about 15 minutes, Maggie heard the familiar rumble of Hank's old motorbike. She watched in the rearview mirror as he pulled up behind her truck and quickly dismounted as Hank approached. Connor ER, etched on his weathered face. Maggie took a deep breath. She knew what she was about to say would sound crazy. But if there was anyone in the world who would understand, who would believe her, it was Hank. He opened the passenger door and climbed in, turning to face her with worried eyes. "Maggie, what's going on? Are you okay?" Maggie looked at her husband, the man who had stood by her side through the darkest days of their lives. She saw in his eyes the same pain, the same desperate hope that had sustained them both for the past decade. "Hank," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. I think I might have found a clue about Fiona." And with that, she began to recount the events at the Becca farm, her voice growing stronger with each word as she spoke. She watched Hank's expression change from concern to disbelief, and finally to a cautious, fragile hope the sun had nearly set. By the time Maggie finished recounting her experience at the Becca farm, the interior of the truck was bathed in a soft, fading light, casting long shadows across their faces. Hank sat in stunned silence, his eyes wide as he processed the information. A pink Hello Kitty headband. He finally said, his voice barely above a whisper, and Clay's reaction. "When you mentioned a child," Maggie nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to stop them from shaking. "I know it sounds crazy, Hank, but you remember how Fiona always loved those headbands and the way Clay acted. There's something not right about all this." Hank ran a hand through his graying hair, his brow furrowed in concentration. "But Maggie, the police searched all the nearby farms after Fiona disappeared. They would have found her if she was there, wouldn't they?" Maggie shook her head, frustration evident in her voice. "Think about it. Hank, those farmlands are huge. There are so many buildings, so many hidden corners. Do you really think the police had time?" to search every nook and cranny as the implications of her words sank in. Hank's expression changed from skepticism to a mixture of anger and determination. "You're right," he said, his voice low and intense. "Now that you mention it, I remember suspecting Clay at the beginning, but when the police assured us he had nothing to do with it." Maggie reached out and placed a hand on Hank's arm, feeling the tension in his muscles. "Getting angry now won't help us get Fiona back," she said softly. "We need to think rationally, not emotionally." Hank took a deep breath, visibly trying to calm himself. "You're right, of course. What do you think we should do? Should we call the police?" Maggie considered for a moment before shaking her head. "I don't think they do anything, based just on a headband and Clay's strange behavior. Even if they did decide to investigate, they'd need a search warrant, and for that, they'd need more evidence." "So what are you suggesting?" Hank asked, a note of apprehension in his voice. Maggie met his gaze, her eyes filled with determination. "I think we need to find out the truth ourselves, Hank. We can't just sit back and do nothing. Not when there's even the slightest chance that Fiona might be there." Hank was quiet for a long moment, weighing her words when he finally spoke. His voice was filled with a mixture of fear and reason. "Are you sure about this, Maggie? What if we're wrong? What if we're just seeing what we want to see?" Maggie understood his hesitation. They'd been down so many dead ends over the years, chased so many false leads, each time the disappointment had been crushing. But this felt different. "I know it sounds crazy," she said softly, "but my gut is telling me something isn't right here. Even if there's just a tiny chance, don't we owe it to Fiona to try?" Hank looked at her for a long moment, then slowly nodded. "You're right," he said, his voice growing stronger. "If there's even the slightest possibility that our little girl is there, we have to do something." As the last rays of sunlight disappeared below the horizon, Maggie and Hank sat in the truck, formulating a plan. They knew the risks were high, that they might be setting themselves up for another heartbreak. But the possibility of finding Fiona, of finally bringing their daughter home after all these years, was too powerful to ignore. As darkness fell over the Nebraska countryside, two parents prepared to take matters into their own hands, driven by a desperate hope and an unshakable love for their lost child. Maggie and Hank made their way back to the Becca farm. The headlights of Maggie's truck cut through the darkness, illuminating the empty country road ahead. Both of them were tense, the weight of what they were about to do pressing heavily on their shoulders as they approached the turnoff to Clay's property. Maggie killed the headlights and slowly coasted to a stop, parking the truck behind a thick cluster of trees that would hide it from view for a moment. They sat in silence, the enormity of their decision sinking in. "Are you sure about this?" Hank asked one last time. His voice barely above a whisper. Maggie nodded, her face set with determination. "We have to know, Hank. We can't walk away from this." With a deep breath, they exited the truck and began making their way towards the farm on foot. The moon, nearly full, cast an eerie silver light over the landscape, creating deep shadows that seemed to shift and move as they walked, as they neared the edge of Clay's property. Hank suddenly grabbed Maggie's arm, pulling her to a stop. "Wait," he whispered urgently. "I have an idea." Maggie looked at him questioningly as he continued. "I'll go to the house and distract Clay. I'll tell him I need to discuss the next hay delivery or some invoices while I keep him busy. You can search around the farm." Maggie considered the plan for a moment before nodding her agreement. It was risky, but it gave them the best chance of searching without being caught. They crept closer to the farmhouse, staying low and using the shadows for cover when they were within sight of the front porch. Hank gave Maggie's hand a quick squeeze before stepping out into the open and striding purposefully towards the house. Maggie watched as Hank knocked on the door, her heart pounding in her chest. After what felt like an eternity, the door opened and she could make out Clay's silhouette in the doorway. She heard the low murmur of voices as Hank engaged Clay in conversation, drawing him further into the house. Taking a deep breath to steady herself, Maggie began to move. She made her way towards the barn where she had found the headband earlier, her eyes constantly scanning for any sign of movement or danger. The barn door creaked slightly as she pushed it open, and Maggie winced at the sound. She slipped inside, allowing her eyes to adjust to the dim interior. The smell of hay and animals filled her nostrils as she moved cautiously through the space. Maggie's eyes darted around, searching for anything out of place, any sign that might lead her to Fiona. She looked in every corner, behind hay bales and in empty stalls. Her heart raced with each step, hope and fear wearing within her. In a low voice, barely above a whisper, she called out, "Fiona, Fiona, are you here?" She paused, listening intently, but heard only the soft rustling of animals and the distant sound of wind outside moving deeper into the barn. Maggie approached the area where she had found the headband earlier. She scanned the ground, hoping to find it again, but it was gone. Had Clay removed it after her earlier visit, just as she was about to move on? A sound caught her attention. It was faint, so quiet she almost thought she had imagined it. But then she heard it again, a soft, muffled voice. "Help? Hello? I'm here." Maggie's breath caught in her throat. The voice was coming from the direction of the pig enclosures. With trembling legs, she made her way towards the sound, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure it would give her away. As she approached one of the pig cages, the voice grew slightly louder. Maggie climbed onto the edge of the enclosure, peering inside. What she saw made her entire body freeze in shock. There, in the corner of the cage, among the pigs, was a small figure, a little girl, one arm chained to a pole, her body covered in dirt and grime. But even through the filth, Maggie could see the unmistakable red hair. For a moment, Maggie couldn't breathe. She blinked rapidly, certain she must be hallucinating, but the image before her didn't change. With a shaking voice, she whispered, "Fiona, is that you who did this to you?" The girl looked up, her eyes wide with fear. She didn't answer, seeming too scared to speak. Maggie's mind raced. She needed to get help, to get Fiona out of there. With trembling hands, she pulled out her phone and dialed 911 when the dispatcher answered. Maggie's words tumbled out in a rush. "Please, I need help. I found my daughter. She's been missing for 10 years. She's locked in a pig cage at the Becca farm. Please send someone quickly." The dispatcher assured her that officers were on their way. But to Maggie, every second felt like an eternity. She stayed by the cage, speaking softly to Fiona, assuring her that help was coming and that everything would be okay. Maggie's heart pounded in her chest as she waited for the officers to arrive. Her eyes fixed on the pig cage where Fiona lay chained, every second felt like an eternity. The silence of the barn, broken only by the soft grunting of pigs and her own ragged breathing. She silently prayed that help would come before Clay discovered her presence. Suddenly, the barn door creaked open, the sound echoing ominously in the cavernous space. Maggie froze, her body rigid with fear, as Clay appeared in the doorway. He stood still, framed by the entrance, his silhouette backle lit by the moonlight, Outside, the realization that his secret had been uncovered was evident in his eyes, which widened with a mixture of shock and anger. For a terrifying moment, Maggie thought Clay might lunge at her to silence her before help could arrive her. Mind raced, wondering where Hank was. Had Clay done something to him? Why hadn't he been able to distract Clay longer? The question swirled in her mind, adding to her fear. But then the blessed sound of approaching S cut through the night air. Clay's head snapped towards the sound, panic replacing the anger on his face as the sirens grew louder, unmistakably heading their way. Clay turned and ran, disappearing into the darkness beyond the barn. Maggie didn't attempt to stop him. Her only concern now was ensuring her daughter's safety. She could hear shouting outside, officers commanding Clay to surrender, their voices firm and authoritative. Moments later, a group of officers burst into the barn, weapons drawn and flashlights sweeping the area. "Police, identify yourself," they shouted. Maggie raised her hands, her voice shaky as she called out, "I'm Maggie Landry. I'm the one who called you my daughter. She's here." The officers quickly lowered their weapons, recognizing her name. One of them approached the pig cage, peering inside with a look of disbelief and horror. He attempted to open the cage, but found Fiona still chained to a pole by one arm. "We need bolt cutters in here now," he called out to his colleagues. Another officer rushed in. Moments later, the necessary tool in hand. Maggie watched, her heart breaking, as the officer climbed into the cage and began working on the chain. "It's okay, sweetheart," she heard the officer say softly to Fiona. "We're here to help you. You're safe now." Maggie could hear her daughter's quiet sobs, a sound that tore at her very soul after what seemed like an eternity. The officer emerged from the cage with Fiona in his arms. The girl looked small and fragile, her clothes dirty and torn, her red hair matted and tangled. Maggie longed to rush forward and embrace her, but she held back, noticing how Fiona showed no sign of recognizing her. The fear and confusion in her daughter's eyes were palpable, and Maggie knew it was better to give her time and ensure her safety first, as the officer carried Fiona out to the waiting ambulance. Maggie followed her legs, feeling weak and unsteady outside. The night air was filled with the flashing lights of police cars and the murmur of officers securing the scene. Amidst the chaos, Maggie spotted Hank talking to an officer, worry etched deeply on his face. Relief flooded through her at the sight of him safe and unharmed. Hank looked up, his eyes meeting hers, and he quickly made his way over Maggie. He said, his voice thick with emotion, "I'm so sorry I couldn't keep Clay distracted for long." He became suspicious, and he trailed off, his eyes widening as he saw Fiona being loaded into the ambulance. Is that her? Where did you find her?" "In the pig cage," Maggie replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "She was chained inside Hank. Our baby was chained like an animal." The reality of what they discovered hit her anew, and she felt her knees buckled slightly. Hank caught her, holding her steady. "What about Clay?" Maggie asked suddenly, remembering the man responsible for their decade of heartache. Hank pointed to a nearby police vehicle through the window. She could see Clay sitting in the back, his hands cuffed behind him. A wave of relief washed over her, knowing he had been caught and would face justice for his crimes. An officer approached the couple, his face somber. "Mr. and Mrs. Landry," he said gently, "we're taking your daughter to the hospital for a thorough checkup and to ensure her safety. Would you like to follow in one of our vehicles? We can escort you there." Maggie and Hank nodded, both too overwhelmed to speak, as they were led to a waiting police car. Maggie took one last look at the barn where their daughter had been held captive for so long the nightmare wasn't over, she knew. But at least now they had found Fiona. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. And as a family, the police car carrying Maggie and Hank followed closely behind the ambulance, its lights cutting through the darkness of the Nebraska night. Inside, the couple sat in silence, hands clasped tightly together, both lost in their own thoughts about the unbelievable turn of events. Hank was the first to break the silence, his voice thick with emotion. "I told you we'd find her, Maggie," he said softly, squeezing her hand. "But this finding her like this—" He trailed off, unable to put into words the horror of their discovery, what she must have gone through all these years. "It breaks my heart to think about it." Maggie nodded her own thoughts, a whirlwind of joy at finding Fiona alive, and anguish at the suffering she must have endured. "We have her back now," she whispered more to herself than to Hank. "That's what matters. We'll help her through this, whatever it takes." The rest of the drive passed in contemplative silence, both parents lost in their own thoughts and worries about what lay ahead. The flashing lights of the ambulance in front of them served as a constant reminder of the fragile state their daughter was in upon arrival at the hospital. They watched as Fiona was quickly whisked away on a gurney, surrounded by medical staff. An officer gently placed a hand on Maggie's shoulder as she made to follow. "I know you want to be with her," he said kindly, "but it's best to let the doctors examine her first. This must all be very confusing and frightening for her. Give her a little time," reluctantly. Maggie and Hank agreed. They were led to a private room within the hospital, a space typically reserved for police interviews or Team 3916 discussions. 2 officers accompanied them, explaining that they would like to take statements. While the memories were still fresh, "We understand. This is a difficult time," one of the officers said. "But the more information we can gather now, the stronger our case against Clay will be." As Maggie and Hank settled into chairs, the door opened again, and a familiar face entered the room. The detective who had been assigned to Fiona's case all those years ago. The police had clearly called him in due to his extensive knowledge of the case. Mr. and Mrs. Landry, the detective, said, his voice filled with a mixture of relief and regret. "I can't tell you how glad I am that we found Phone. I wish we could have found her sooner." Maggie began recounting the events that led to this moment, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. She told them about finding the headband in Clay's barn, the nagging feeling that something wasn't right, and Clay's suspicious behavior. When she mentioned a child, she detailed their family's history of conflict with the Beckers' information she had shared with the police years ago, but now seemed to take on new significance. The officers diligently noted every detail, occasionally asking for clarification or additional information. When Maggie finished her account, she looked at the detective, confusion and anger wearing in her eyes. "I just don't understand," she said. "How could Clay do such a horrible thing? What could possibly drive a person to steal a child and keep her locked up for 10 years? Hank leaned forward, his face mask of disbelief and anguish. "We knew about the family conflict, the tension between us and the Beckers," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "There were land disputes, arguments at town meetings, cold shoulders at the county fair. But this," he shook his head, struggling to comprehend the magnitude of Clay's actions. "I never in my wildest nightmares imagined it could lead to something like this. How could anyone twist a petty feud into justification for stealing a child. Maggie reached out and squeezed Hank's hand, her own eyes filling with tears. All those years, she whispered, all those times we saw Clay in town or at the market. He knew where our little girl was, and he just went on with his life like nothing was wrong. The detective nodded solemnly, understanding the parents' struggle to reconcile their past experiences with the horrific reality they now faced. Unfortunately, he said gently, sometimes people can justify the most terrible actions to themselves, especially when there's a history of conflict. But I want you both to know nothing. No land dispute, no family feud could ever justify what Clay did. This is on him, not on you. Hank nodded his jaw, clenching as he fought to control his emotions. I just wish we had known. If we had any idea that our disagreements could lead to this, we would have done anything to make peace to protect Fiona. The detective exchanged a glance with his colleagues before speaking. Clay has been surprisingly cooperative since his arrest. He explained he's already confessed to much of what happened. I think he knew it was over. The moment we found Fiona, the officer went on to reveal Clay's account of events. His words sending chills down Maggie and Hank's spines on the day Fiona disappeared in the cornfield. She had wandered onto his property, lost and seeking help, instead of returning her to her parents. Clay had seen an opportunity for revenge over old land disputes between their families. He initially planned to keep her for just a few days. The officer continued, his voice grave, but days turned into weeks, and eventually he decided he would never let her go. He had even considered taking her life. At one point, Maggie gasped, her hand flying to her mouth in horror. Hank's face hardened, his jaw clenching as he listened to the officers. Words Clay confessed that over the years he did terrible things to Fiona, the detective said clearly, struggling with the information himself. I won't go into details now, but we'll need to discuss it eventually to build our case. When the officer offered them a break, seeing the distress on their faces, Maggie and Hank declined. They were determined to hear the full truth, no matter how painful. The officer explained that, for the past few months, EUF had been kept in the pig barn as punishment for what Clay termed disobedience. He said she wasn't listening to him anymore, so he decided to teach her a lesson. The detective said, disgust evident in his voice. Hank, who had been silent for most of the interview, finally spoke up. But why didn't you find her when you searched the properties after she disappeared? Surely you must have looked in that barn. The detective sighed heavily. We did search the properties, including Clay's farm, but he must have hidden her where else during that time. And you have to understand, the farmland out there is vast. There are so many buildings, so many possible hiding places. It's not an excuse, but it helps explain why we missed her. Finally, Hank asked the question that had been burning in both their minds. Will he face justice for this? Do you have enough evidence to make sure that monster never sees the light of day again? The detective's face hardened with determination. With Clay's confession and the EV evidence we've gathered, I can assure you he'll most likely spend the rest of his life in prison. We'll make sure of it. As the interview wound down, Maggie and Hank sat in stunned silence, trying to process everything. They had learned the nightmare of the past 10 years suddenly felt both distant and incredibly immediate. They had found their daughter, but the road ahead was far from easy as Maggie and Hank sat absorbing the horrifying details of their daughter's ordeal. The door to the interview room opened softly, A nurse entered her face, a mixture of professional calm and genuine empathy. "Mr. and Mrs. Landry," she said gently, "I have an update on your daughter Fiona. She's doing better now. The doctor has stabilized her condition." Maggie and Hank leaned forward, eager for any news about their child. The nurse continued, her voice soft but clear. "We found parasites and other infections in her body, likely due to the conditions she was living in. But I want to assure you, she will recover from this with proper treatment. Can we see her?" Maggie asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and hope. The nurse looked to the officers, who nodded their assent. "Yes, you can see her now," the nurse replied. "But please, remember, this is all very overwhelming for her. Take it slow." Maggie and Hank followed the nurse through the sterile hospital corridors, their hearts pounding with anticipation. When they entered Fiona's room, they were struck by the sight of their daughter. She looked so small in the hospital bed, but cleaner now. Her red hair washed and combed, the improvement in her appearance, though slight, brought them a measure of relief. They approached the bed, carefully mindful of the nurse's warning. "Fiona," Maggie said softly, her voice filled with love and concern. "We're your parents. Do you remember us?" Fiona looked at them, her eyes wide and uncertain. After a moment, she shook her head slightly. "No," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't remember. My parents." The words hit Maggie and Hank like a physical blow, but they forced themselves to remain calm. "That's okay, sweetheart," Hank said gently. "We'll figure this out together." Maggie, fighting back tears, tried a different approach. "Fiona, do you remember anything from when you were little? Before Clay's farm?" She hesitated, then added, "We used to have a German Shepherd dog when you were about 2. Do you remember him?" Fiona's brow furrowed in concentration. After a long moment, she spoke hesitantly. I think I remember a dog, but it's not clear, just little bits of memory. This small recollection, as vague as it was, filled Maggie and Hank with hope. But their joy was short-lived, as Fiona's next words shattered their hearts all over again. "What did I do wrong?" Fiona asked, her voice small and frightened. "Why was I locked up?" Clay said, "I deserved it. He said it was my family's fault." Maggie felt a surge of fury at Clay's cruel lies. She had to take a deep breath to calm herself before speaking. "Oh, Fiona," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You did nothing wrong. Nothing at all. Clay is a very sick person who hurt you terribly, but you didn't deserve any of it. None of this was your fault." Hank nodded in agreement. "You're safe now," he added. "You'll never have to live in fear again. We're here for you, and we'll do whatever it takes to help you." As they spoke to Fiona, offering reassurances and gentle explanations, a social worker entered the room. She introduced herself and explained that she was there to help them navigate the complex situation they found themselves in. "It's a very delicate case," the social worker explained. "Our primary goal is to ensure Fiona feels safe and comfortable. The fact that she has some memories from her past is a good sign. It will make it easier for you to bond again, and for Fiona to understand that you are indeed her real parents." The social worker went on to outline their immediate plans. "For now, we think it's best if Fiona stays in a temporary social house. It's a safe, neutral environment where she can begin to adjust." But she added, seeing the concern on Maggie and Hank's faces, "We have options for parents to stay there too. This will allow you to spend time with Fiona and get to know each other again in a controlled, supportive setting." Maggie and Hank listened intently, nodding their understanding. The social worker's voice took on a note of cautious optimism as she continued. Based on what I've seen so far, I believe there's a good chance that Fiona will come to accept you as her parents again, with time and patience. I think she'll be able to live with you permanently. These words filled Maggie and Hank with a sense of hope they hadn't dared to feel in years. But they also knew the road ahead would be long and challenging. What matters most right now, Maggie said, looking at Fiona's fragile form in the hospital bed, is that Fiona feels safe, will do whatever it takes, whatever she needs. Hank nodded in agreement. We've waited 10 years to find her, he said, his voice rough with emotion. We can be patient now. We'll take it one day at a time. As they sat with Fiona holding her hands and offering gentle words of comfort, Maggie and Hank were acutely aware of the journey that lay ahead. There would be legal battles to face as Clay's case moved through the justice system. There would be difficult times as Fiona struggled to overcome her trauma and adjust to her new reality. But for the first time in a decade, they could see a future filled with hope. They had found their daughter, against all odds, and they were determined to help her heal and thrive as the first light of dawn began to filter through the hospital room window. Maggie and Hank silently renewed their commitment to their daughter and to each other. The story wasn't over in many ways. It was just beginning. But whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together as a family, reunited with love, patience, and unwavering support. They would help Fiona reclaim the life that had been stolen from her, one day at a time.